Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 514 of Constructive Criticism. I'm your host, CZ, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mason Clark.
Hey, how you doing, Spencer?
I'm okay. I am down 30 pounds right now, and
Nice.
I can, do things that I could not do a month ago, and it feels nice.
That's great. Yeah. Sick.
It feels good. How you been? I feel like we've been texting more, but if we just send each other memes and TikToks.
Sure. Yeah. I'm good. I've just been working a lot. That's just been it, really, to be honest. So, a lot of stuff going on in life. Kind of a hectic day, but hey, we're here now to talk about Magic, Modern. It's going to be a fun time.
Yeah, today is going to be our Pro Tour reaction episode. For those unaware, Pro Tour Modern Horizons 3 happened. And we're going to talk about kind of the top decks, the metagame, some other stuff. But before we do that, we always want to talk about always improving. It's the way that we try to focus on the show to keep us grounded and make sure that we're providing content that's not only helping others improve, but ourselves get better all the time. And Mason, it is your turn to go first. What was your always improving moment this week?
Yeah, my always improving moment this week comes from, I wanted to try out specifically this Yogg deck that's been going around, because the Yogg deck was so different than it was before. If you've seen it, it's like the top Yogg players are playing like Earthing Ritual and stuff like that, like Aetherian Nightmare. But then at the Pro Tour, people were still kind of doing the old Yogg thing, right? And my gut was that, hey, the old Yogg thing, I think, is stronger still, right? That was kind of my guess. And I was like, this stuff is really cool. Birthing Ritual is one of my favorite cards in the set. So I was really excited to see players playing it. But I was just suspect of Agatha Soul Cauldron is so good in that deck. And it's such a powerful card that wins games on its own. And I was very hesitant of the fact that we had moved away from all of those and down to one Grist. But I was like, you know what? It does look really fun. And I think that it probably would benefit me a lot to playing this. And so while I had the Jeskai control deck sleeved up that, the GOAT Javier had played or whatever, and I, bought the cards for that, I was like, I also just own all the cards for this Yogg deck. I'll just play this Yogg deck tomorrow at my local Modern tournament. And, I'll play it on no reps just sort of see what it was like. And Spencer, it was surprisingly good and really fun to play. And that was really awesome. Where when I was playing it, it felt not like Yogg. And it occurred to me what really happened is these are two different decks. And one is like a grindy mid-range deck that has this combo finish. And that's like MH2 Yogg. So Soul Cauldron might be the best thing to mention. And then this other one is like this engine, I'm going to slowly go up the chain, get a little bit of value, and then I eventually will assemble a combo haphazardly. But I'm just going to kind of present this constant string of creatures that's kind of frustrating to deal with for some decks in Modern. And it was super powerful, relative to kind of what it looked like. And it was some of the most fun I've had playing in a while. And, I ended up splitting top four, whatever, with the deck and just had a blast and played a lot of really good games. And it was just good to kind of understand, I'm really good at eyeballing things and kind of typically ending up I think in a pretty relative okay, it's about that strong. But what I failed with this deck was just how different it was than Yawgmoth. And the learning moment really comes from, I put it through the lens of that and not through the lens of a Birching Ritual deck, which is really what it is. It is a combo-y deck. So it was really fun and really cool.
I love that. My always improving is actually really similar. If you listen to the Patreon only episode, you know that we had a pretty large discussion about green, specifically in Pioneer. And one of the things that I was talking about on the show was that I wanted to really dive deep into possibly not playing Leyline and not playing Mom and just playing a more classic version with the Trailblazers and stuff. And the way this came from was a RCQ winning deck list that I think had won 9 and or at an RCQ somewhere that I had found. And I really liked it. And so I wanted to try it out. And I immediately, after our episode, and playing, found the problems that we had identified that might come up from doing that, and specifically around Wolf Willow Haven versus Leyline, and why maybe Wolf Willow is actually just not very well positioned in a world where you're playing to the board a lot more than you were before, and thus having something that just basically checks your devotion off for you becomes a lot more important. I ended up playing against Blue-White a couple times with Matt, And we just immediately noted that like it was really hard to actually get any devotion going for that reason.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And a thing that we actually kind of talked about too on that show was the spirits matchup. Spencer, I don't know if you remember that. It was near the end.
I did. I saw your RC.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember how I was like, yeah, I think it's actually better for us because they have wedding announcement. And it's funny because I played against kind of old spirits and new spirits. And while the new spirits deck is definitely better, and the person I lost in the top 4 playing the like wedding announcement version of spirits is someone I know locally here who's like played the pro tour and is very good and just basically loves to play spirits and kind of one tricks it for the most part. And he was like, yeah, this matchup's much worse for me. But post board, he's like, I still have like all these cards that just are randomly good against you. So you kind of get wrecked. And I was like, all right, that is true. And, was really showing to me because I had a bunch of ley line draws.
Yeah.
And what my ley line draws actually gave me a chance to beat this deck where, in the top 8, I basically had like Exodia where like I put in double ley line and it was just like Citadel go and had the Nykthos rolled up and was like, what are you gonna do? You gonna play a land? You gonna play a creature? You're dead if you do. And like the ability to randomly high roll like that, I think is something that maybe we didn't get through in the episode enough. And I think if you really like in-depth conversations, we spent about an hour talking about Pioneer, about 40 minutes of that on green. And we go into a lot of detail and back and forth, and it was really cool. So check out that episode. But yeah, the high rolls of Guild Pack letting you win matchups you normally can never win is going up in my appreciation. I also played Spirits 4 times, so maybe I'm a little biased with some stuff. I'm still trying to figure that out a little.
Like Mason said, if you want to support the show directly, head over to patreon.com/ccmtg. You can listen to that episode where, like Mason says, we dive deep on card choices and why, and it was a fun conversation that is available to patrons of $5 more, just like every bonus episode every month.
We mentioned it to patrons, but we didn't mention on the show yet. The bonus episodes have changed. Sometimes we used to do mailbag, and we used to do episodes like this. The new plan is to have them be RCQ or RC related. If the timing's right, like let's say we're doing it 2 weeks before the RC, we're going to have it there. But they're going to be deep dives like that continuously going forward. So if you like that one, you expect to see more of them. If that sounds like something you might enjoy, maybe wait, have a second one come out, listen to 2 of them, and then, maybe that's the perfect time to become a patron. So just wanted to highlight that kind of on the main show. We mentioned the patrons, but I don't think we mentioned it on the show.
Next thing I just want to talk about is check out our sponsor, Untapped.gg. They have been the sponsor of this podcast for a while. I obviously, talk about how much I love using them for Arena. I did my first Modern Horizons 3 draft this week and got to show kind of how that worked to Matt Kling with the premium account and the things that you get for limited and things like that. Just really appreciate them and the overlay. So check them out and use the link in the show notes in order to sign up. All right, let's talk about Pro Tour Modern Horizons 3, Mason. There's a lot to cover. We have the metagame, we have the announcement. I put in the win rates and stuff there for you. Should we talk about the announcement first that I wanted to cover? Or should we talk about the metagame first?
I think probably talking about the announcement first, if we're going to mention it, is best. I think, it's more important to me.
I just think that, we're a competitive Magic podcast, right? And we usually talk about Constructed. But I also think that it's important to, just celebrate when Wizards does something really, really good. And I just think that what they did announcing the Kai Budde Player of the Year trophy it's the type of thing that would happen in other sports and in other games, and that does happen in those type of spaces all the time. And I don't know about you, Mason, but I remember playing with Kai Budde and John Finkel Worlds decks, those decks that they used to make just as a kid. We used to play them when I worked at Oasis. We would just get all the World Championship decks out and just battle each other just to play games in different ways. And, for me as the self-proclaimed biggest PV fan, there's always this conversation, about the longevity of somebody like PV or John versus the absolute dominance of somebody like Kai. And I can't think of a better person more deserving of having the Player of the Year trophy named after them than Kai.
Yeah, it's probably worth mentioning too, this is all announced along with Kai kind of sharing publicly that he has terminal cancer, and this might have been his last pro tour. And I personally never really interacted much with Kai or knew him, but like his resume and like part of the history of the game like precedes him. And like, Spencer's talking about playing with the world stack. So by the time I started playing Magic, Kai had basically stopped playing. But back to that sort of resume thing, he started playing like a lot again, not so long after I started trying to grind to get to the Pro Tour. And, has like a Pro Tour top 8, won a PTQ at this last one. And just like one of the things I think is really impressive to me about like a GOAT conversation is that like, yeah, the Finkel Kai stuff, and I think the PV, and honestly, a thing I've been saying for a long time is that Javier is working his way into that top 5 conversation. Outside looking in, but I think Javier's up there. And I think one of the things about it that really like cements it to me that it's like a Kai PV race is that Kai never like, he took like a little break, but never really stopped performing, and like him getting that player of the year, the player of all time trophy, I think is just very deserving, and it's very awesome. And I am really, really sorry that he had some wrong luck with it when it came to it all. So, yeah.
Thank you. I couldn't say it. I was going to cry if I talked about it. So, just congratulations to him. And I don't know what else to say there other than like, good on Wizards. Let's talk about the metagame. So the metagame got shown. Actually, I thought the metagame article, I don't know if you got the chance to read it, Mason, was pretty good as far as like metagame articles go. Frank Carson just does a great job. And just to kind of read it off for the listeners, day 1, Bant Nadu presented 20% of the field, 20.2, and 4-color Nadu, 5.3. So about 25.5% of the metagame were Nadu decks. I think that is slightly higher than the Phoenix showed in Pioneer, right?
I believe my understanding was it was the highest percentage, but besides Oko, I believe Oko was higher.
You're saying
second highest.
You're saying this?
So I think this was second highest in my understanding.
Sorry, I thought.
No, you're good. I looked into it. I didn't see anyone officially say it, but what I had saw was that I believe that Oko was a higher percentage, and I believe Phoenix was not as high as this.
Yeah. That is my understanding as well. We have Ruby Storm with 9.5, Jeskai Control coming in at 9.1. An interesting note on that is that Jeskai Wizards comes in at 4.9%. So they do delineate between the kind of the
Tameo and the one, right?
Yeah, the Tameo and the non-Tameo decks. And then Monoblock Necro comes in at 7%, Eldrazi at 5.8%, Boros Energy at 5.3%, and that's kind of it. Like Monoblack Brief, basically non-Necro decks, 2.5%. I don't know what Jeskai Dress Down is, to be honest.
Jeskai Dress Down is the Flage control deck. It's another Jeskai deck, but it's the one that plays Dress Down and Consign to Memory in the main deck.
Got it.
As a way to sort of, and they also have Null Drifter, so for those at home.
And then we have Rule Eldrazi at 2.5%, leaving 25.5% to other decks.
There are two big things delineated here. One is the Nadu decks. The best Nadu performing decks were the Bant ones at I believe 58.3%, which for what it's worth, from our understanding of information that was, I don't think supposed to be ours, about Hogak and stuff like that originally, that deck had a 56% win rate on Modo, and that is what got it banned. And that was one of the best performing decks of all time. So at least in Modern. So, I mean, it is one tournament, but it is a very, very damning thing there. And the other big one that I think that jumped out to a lot of people is Ruby Storm at 32.5% win rate, which is abysmal. Just one of the worst win rates you've ever seen from a deck that was played so heavily. And, I mean, we could talk a lot about Nadu. I think Spencer and I are probably in agreement that something might happen there, but there's no real use in us speculating on that, right? I know. I feel pretty confident that something's probably going to happen to Nadu.
I'd be a little shocked if there was not a banning before Modern season of something in Nadu, if not just Nadu itself.
Yeah, and I think one thing I've seen, because, for transparency, this is happening a couple days after the Pro Tour, it's the 4th of July week. A lot of the company is over in Europe because of the Pro Tour, and they're getting back, and they have to have meetings for things like this. So there was never going to be a BNR that happened like in the first couple of days of the week, right?
Yeah.
The earliest we're looking at is sometime next week. So, and we have a couple of weeks before the Modern season starts. I personally fully believe there will be a BNR announcement of some kind, and I really think it is a Nadu situation, not Shuko. I've heard a lot of conversations about Bridge from Below. And one, they've kind of said that, hey, we think that was a mistake. We should have aimed for the head in that situation. And two, Bridge from Below is kind of not a real Magic card. Like, it doesn't really function. So, like, banning it isn't like the end of the world. And I honestly believe someday that card could be unbanned. I think it'd actually be very funny if they unbanned it right when they banned Nadu. Anyways, I think if I was Wizards, that's the way I'd do
it. I love that. I think that's probably all the conversation we'll have about potential bannings.
Yeah.
I would like to talk about the teams and what they played really quickly. And kind of one of the things that really stood out to me is that none of the teams all played all the same deck, and some of the teams didn't even have the same 75 for their Nadu lists. What do you make of that?
One thing is that there's just, and I mentioned this a lot last week on the episode, so if you listen to that one, you've heard me say this before, but there's not a lot of time from the release of MH3 to the Pro Tour, even though it's a normal amount of time, compared to OTJ and Murders. There are just so many more cards, and the format is so much more dense. So what normally it's pretty tight for, we got to get running to figure out constructed, right? And we got to hurry. That is compounded with the Modern Horizon sets. And so to me, it makes a lot of sense that there's some, okay, we all agree that Nadu is the best, but the 74th and 75th card, or more importantly, really the main deck, right? The main deck cards are okay, I'm not exactly sure. Do I want to have this or that? Or do I want my win condition to, be the loop? Or do I want to have Oracle? Do I want to have Bristling Bill? There's a lot of differing little things there. And I think that it really shows just how much things were figured out, but also how much more room there is to go. And I think it also really, Spencer, goes back to our reasonable deck game, I think we talked about, right? Having the best build of something is theoretically the best, shocker. But having a very good build with good plans that you understand and playing well matters, a lot as well. And we're seeing players succeed with that. Bant Nadu was the most successful deck, but 4-color Nadu in the hands of Ghoul the Cat also did very well. And, that deck, while a small percentage of the room, still was able to put up stuff kind of going in a completely different direction. So I think there's a lot of space to explore. I think we won't see a lot of the Nadu exploration, but it's very interesting in a theoretical sense.
I agree with everything you said. And honestly, the reason I wanted to highlight the teams is you have teammates playing different decks in the top 8. With Sam Pardee taking second with Nadu, and a very interesting version of Mono Black in the hands of Seth, which was so different. It was actually really funny. In preparing for this podcast, I was looking at decks with my friend Matt, and he is going off about one of these Mono Black decks and a lot of the things that he's I don't understand why you would do it this way, and here's why, and this and this and this. And I was like, have you seen the Seth deck? And he's like, oh, everything that I don't like about the other deck Seth is doing. What was funny about that is that he's like, that's interesting because it means to him it meant he kind of was wouldn't you think that other people would end up there then? Wouldn't you think that similar things would have ended up happening? The number of lands that you play versus flip lands, the number of, all of the things to make Necro Dominance the best that it can be. I thought that was really interesting where Seth ended up and how that looked.
Yeah, I think there's the MDFCs are some of the cards I think are some of the biggest standouts. In fact, we highlighted that on our set review show, right? That I was hey, all of these cards easily could have been on the list. And it really changes the way your deck building heuristics work. And it really changes it when you add cards like March and Soul Spike to your deck. And now it's okay, these are lands that cost me life, but they also enable my spells, which gain me life. So what is the mixture? And, I honestly can believe everything from you're supposed to have all of them in your deck to you're supposed to have 5 of them in your deck. You know what I mean? Depending on kind of the way you want to build your deck and your goals. And so, it does make sense that on Long Enough Timeline, we're probably going to have a lot of convergence on what the ideas are, but there's a lot of new things to think about. When we got the MDFCs in the past, the good ones are tapped, and that was basically a non-starter in the older formats, right? If you weren't trying to do something like kind of illegal, like belchering, right, you weren't really like interested in these cards, And then Agadeem's Awakening, only by the power of grief and like the low mana value of Scam, even got to a 1-up status. But like kind of going beyond that was Heresy. It was just not strong enough. Well, you got strong enough cards in MH3. What does that mean for your deck? I was playing a little bit earlier with a friend, actually, Spencer, and we were playing a Birthing Ritual deck. And I was like, let's just play 4 of this, the green layer, I forget her name now, the elf. And, we were doing some weird persisty, trying to put Terrastinons into play on turn 2. But, like, it really changes your deck building in a way that's, like, not normally existed.
Is she a 5-drop or a 6-drop?
She's a 6-drop.
6-drop.
So we had generous ints that we were persisting back as part of the ways. And so she was like a thing you could hit off Birthing Ritual to like sacrifice something else and draw cards. It was a for fun deck that we were just kind of like riffing and having a good time with. But it really like, that was thing was like, oh, we have to really think about how different these things are. And I think Troll is like another good card in that same vein, right? Like I talked about playing all the enablers. Like, do you play Troll as well? Like that is a card that's like a tap swamp that works for all your stuff. And so there's just so many different things.
And I think, we can move on to Control really quick to actually talk about that because, the kind of how the control decks are built, right? With Alluring Revealed, it like a card that, kind of changed Modern for a little bit. We see decreasing in numbers across these control decks in favor of kind of resource management cards in a lot of ways. And that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, there's just a lot of stuff to figure out. And it's going to be very interesting, And I mentioned this in the show last week. What does Modern look like in 1 month? What's it look like in 3? What's it look like in 6? What's it look like in a year? Because I think we're going to learn a lot about these decks. And I would not be surprised if Necro is maybe a deck that we see a lot. Eventually, like I said, it'll probably congeal at some point. But, convert, I should say. But, like, for a while, it would not surprise me if we even see builds that, like, have less of these lands, right? Or go all in. And it's going to be really interesting just a couple of weeks to see what happens with the decks, especially, like if things shake up, right? Because an interesting thing to me, and, we're going to talk about Control here in a second too, is a lot of decisions are made based on the threats you have to answer, specifically with Control decks, right? And Nadu really puts a lot of pressure on saying like, hey, you need to have something that can kill a Nadu. Right? Like I think Galvanic Discharge is a really strong card. It gets extra strong when it's able to kill Nadu, right? Bolt can't hit that. But if your deck is a deck that like dies to Bolt, like the threats are, I should say, then maybe Bolt becomes a better card in some spots, right? If you're not playing like the Wraths or the Attunes. So it's a really interesting song and dance. And as the format shifts, I think we could see some amount of shifting with these decks.
I mean, where do you think that, you look at something like Javier's deck, where do you think this deck stands right now?
I really like the deck. I know the data-wise it wasn't the best, but it's really fun to play. I think quite strong. I think we also saw just like Javier play incredibly well in a lot of spots. I mean, as he always does. And if you like, he gets a lot of future matches because he is such a strong player and so methodical. And it really shows just how good this deck is at like stabilizing. And if you play around everything, you like low-key kind of can in a lot of spots and get out of it. And really the deck just needs to adapt, or needs to find a way to adapt to, I believe Sun Cleanser is the name, the 2-drop that makes it so you can't get energy, as we saw that card kind of KO Javier. But like that is sort of a very interesting thing to me. And I think, there's like the Jeskai Wizard deck, I believe, did worse than the Jeskai Ring deck, which is sort of the delineation here. But I think we talked about this last week, sort of the different threats you're fighting might make the move happen. I think there's just a lot of fluidity to what's going on here. But the One Ring is still good, It's still a strong card.
Turns out.
If Abe was here, he would say it.
Turns out that card's still good. I got to ask, and I know that you care about this topic. Talk to me about Invert Polarity and how you feel about the card, Mason.
Oh, I think Invert Polarity is like a sick card. Like, it is very interesting. Just like, it is a cancel, which is a lot of mana. And if the games are about resolving 1 or 2 big spells, I think Invert Polarity is very strong. It is sort of like this game-ending card. Former co-host of the show, Trey, actually came to our local RCQ and we played, and he ended up winning. And I was hanging out with him and watching him win as I made the top 4. And then we played some games afterwards. And Trey lost every Invert Polarity flip. So if I go by my recent games, it's the best card ever, Spencer. I just stole Trey's Flage every time. but we were also playing a control mirror, where that was one of the few cards that matters.
Yeah.
If Trey was playing a deck that was like, let's say, mono black grief scam, like that sort of deck, or any sort of like burn or prowessy deck, that card would have been unplayable. So to me, it's a really interesting card where I think it is very powerful when the game is about one or two big spells resolving. And if the game's about a lot of little spells, it is not as strong while still being pretty good. And a playable cancel is an interesting thing to have in the format.
Yeah, I think that it's sweet. I just like it has enough upside to like be like, all right, I'll put this in my deck.
I also love, by the way, that sometimes it isn't all upside. Like, I know I mentioned this a little last week, but like in RG, when the player had to like rub his hands against Living End because he had a 50-50 that it didn't counter the Living End, he has to, it still gets cast. It's just your spell.
Yeah.
And so I love that kind of like wild thing that I bet you he didn't think about when he was building his deck comes up in like very unique ways. That's some of the coolest parts of Magic to me.
You already mentioned it, but I just wanted to kind of focus on Storm for just a second. I don't think that I trust the results of this Pro Tour to like say, oh, this deck's bad. I don't think that's what's happening.
And by default, you think Nadu is fine and they're not going to ban it. They listen
no,
to
that's not.
I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
I don't think that many people can, like end up on a bad deck.
Well, I think there's a lot going on here. One of the biggest things is I think people came prepared to beat Storm.
Right.
And I think this is also a damning thing for Nadu. That's like a quick aside too, right? It's like going to this Pro Tour, Nadu and Storm were like the two new decks you had to beat.
Right.
Like people knew there was like a Necro deck, probably people knew there was a Jeskai deck, but like these were like, if you don't beat these decks, your deck isn't good enough. And people came prepared for those decks. Now Nadu was the best win rate deck with a high play rate by a lot, of that, and while being prepared against. And then Storm, very high play rate still. We had incredibly strong players like LSV, John Finkel, and Kai Budde all played the exact same 75. And they did not have a very good win percentage in Constructed because people came prepared and had the hate to beat it. And that is one of the most damning things about the Nadu to me, where if Nadu was like this secret deck that no one knew about going into things that was tight to the chest, only the super teams knew it, maybe we would have a little bit more time to learn. But everyone knew about these decks, and Storm folds to it. And this is sort of like one of the things that I actually talked about when working on this set was like, these Storm cards are really strong, but I truly believe if players put the right tools in their sideboard, they can beat these cards. It might limit some decks, right? Like you can't play your Tron deck or whatever that doesn't have Trinisphere on the weekends where Storm is the best, but like that's fine. That stuff already occurs. So Storm, I think, is a deck that is strong. I definitely thought it was a little overhyped, but the fact that it can kill on turn 3 is so powerful, and sometimes even turn 2. So, yeah, I think the deck's good. I don't think 32% is probably its norm, but I bet you every time people are talking about Storm a lot, that is the normal win rate.
It's kind of, I think that was true of like Blue-Red Storm. I think that was true of Affinity. I think that was true, I think that's true of a Living End right now. Like, there's lots of decks that ends up happening with. We kind of talked about the data a little bit. I don't want to like harp on this too much. It's so hard with kind of the result of this to gain a lot from what you should think about. I think, do RCQs start in August for Modern, or do they? Yeah,
it's August 1st. Yep.
Okay. How do you think the PT impacts the Modern metagame? Like, if we let's just say Nadu Goblin. Okay, what do you think you should take from there?
I think there are a couple things. The first thing to take, right, is that there are a lot of different strategies you can play. And also, for its worth, I think there was some talk about how MH3 killed all the MH2 decks, which I don't think is true. Just a situation of Nadu is so good that you should play it over these other decks, right? Lots of people who were like Rhinos type players did that. So I think what we're going to see is that the MH3 decks and the things that promote so far, you need to be aware of them, and you have to build your sideboard with cards with like decks like Storm in mind, because players saw Storm early, they bought it, and they went to play, and you get a lot of really good ideas on what some raw, powerful decks are. I think Javier's Jeskai deck probably doesn't change all that much if Nadu gets banned, but it probably changes a little. And like knowing like, okay, this shell is really strong. Same with the Necro Dominance deck. On Twitter today, sort of one of the narratives is that Necro Dominance is like clearly the best deck if they ban Nadu. So like, what are you going to do in response to that? We're like, you should buy that deck. And, I think there's a lot of differing opinions and things you could look at, but there are a lot of really strong decks. There are a lot of really powerful synergies. And like I said before, we're just now starting to reach that first full month of MH3. And there's going to be a lot to still learn and discover. And when Nadu's gone, I think it's going to really relieve some amount of pressure on what you can and can't do.
I think for me, the format kind of got to a squeeze really quick between really 3 decks, in my opinion: Mono Black, Nadu, and Storm. And it's like, because they're while 2 of those are combo decks, they're also like attacking in very different ways. Like, it's one of them's a creature combo deck, one of them's a spell-based combo deck. Like, that's just a clear delineation and difference. And so finding cards that like worked in lots of spots was going to be hard. But that being said, people still came prepared to beat Nadu. And I think a lot will open up that you don't have to focus on that most much, like Mason's saying. I will also say that the idea that like all the other decks other than MH3 decks are dead is a little silly. Like, we literally had an undefeated Gorios player at this Pro Tour. So,
and multiple PTQ winners too.
Yeah, like
I think their only new card was Psychic.
Yeah. So yeah. I think that's just silly. And we also had the sweetest rule prowess list in the history of mankind come out of this Pro Tour. Scale Up and Assault Strove are like, that's tech. Like, let's go. I loved it.
Yeah, it's super cool. I think there's as always, I think Modern is actually habitually underexplored, and there's a lot left to be going. And like we talked about before, the incentives are for you to do the best you can at the Pro Tour, especially at the end of the year Pro Tour, where a lot of people are trying to lock in worlds where, like for my friend Kane, they were talking about how like you don't need a crazy record, or at least where they were, to make it. We just need to put up a good, solid result. So playing a deck like Bant Nadu is really appealing if you test and you're like, this is kind of broken or whatever. I should just play this. Where, let's say Nadu wasn't around, I guarantee you that we would have seen a more diverse metagame. Or just because like Bant Nadu puts a lot of pressure on you to do certain things that some of those decks that didn't appear don't do, and that makes sense. We see that happen with Hammer before, right? Like, Hammer would be good for a while and fall off as the rules of engagement changed in the format.
Where are you starting?
I love mono black decks. So, like I won that SCG a couple months ago now, playing the mono black deck. Kind of, I was like, I really want to play my MH3 deck, and so I'm going to play the MH2 version of it. Is what I did. And so that's when I want to play. I really, like I said before, I enjoyed playing that Yawgmoth deck. It was a lot of fun. Not sure if it's better than actual Yawg, but that one's high on my list. The Jeskai cards are high on my list. Bant value type stuff. So honestly, I'm not exactly sure where I want to go once Nadu's gone, but there's a lot of places I'm really excited to explore it all.
Nice. I got to start with this Brian, the Brian Boss deck. If I, next time I fire up the MTGO, that is exactly where I'm starting. That is so different that you have to try. Like, when a deck is that different, you have to give it a try.
Oh, see, to me, I already know. I'm like, if I play against Storm or Nadu, I win. If I play against Interaction, I'm going to grind. But like, no one goes faster than me.
It was. I saw a couple of Infect lovers in the chat being like, "Oh my gosh, it's back!"
Yeah. Playing Post Pulse is fun.
That's basically what I wanted to cover. Do you have any kind of final thoughts about this Pro Tour? I mean, first of all, congratulations to Simon. I guess we hadn't said that yet. Just really having a phenomenal year. Just you mentioned Javier. That was another one that I wanted to mention. Dude, that stat is crazy for Javier, by the way. That he, in his last, was it 5 events? His lowest finish is 10th?
Yeah, I also think that if you extend it to since the Pro Tour returned, his worst is like top 16 or something like that. Like, he has just consistently dominated basically every event. Now, I don't think he did it at World, so I think that might be where the stat kind of happens or whatever. But like, Javier is just insane, and Simon is also insane too. But like, that's one of the things we were talking about before. Where it's like Javier has continued to show great results over so long, and Simon is on like a Kai Buddha-esque run that Kai even mentioned
that was so
during his announcement, where he's like, like, Simon's trying to take it from me right now. And so, Simon, an incredible player. just so strong. And watching him play is always so impressive. Same with Javier. And I think one of the biggest takes away from me, Spencer, and you mentioned earlier, if I was a viewer, what would I take away from this, right? And we mentioned a lot about decks. The thing I would take away is that tight play and working hard trumps so much, and Magic is such a skill-intensive game, and so people act like it's coin flips. But look also at Jason Yee, right? We're not talking about Jason. I mean, Simon and Javier are on these multi-year runs. Jason played its first Pro Tour at the beginning of the year, missed top 8. Top 8'd the second Pro Tour, top 8'd the third Pro Tour. Top 8'd the RC, a couple months ago. Put up a great finish in Chicago as well, I believe. Like at that Pro Tour, sorry, I'm getting combobulated here. It's been a long day. But like Jason has been doing so well. And to me, that's like 3 players where it looks at where it's like, okay. And like some of these players aren't even working together, right? Like Javier and Simon are, and that's like, okay, yeah, like 2 really strong players working together, that makes sense. But Jason's over here doing its own thing, kind of with Sanctum. I mean, they're not like all together, and they're all crushing it. And so it is you. It is hard work. If you play hard and do well, you will succeed. It is not all variance. And stop acting like it is.
Yeah.
Just put in the work and try your best to succeed. And players like Jason, Javier, Simon, these are proof that we're at a point in Magic right now. And just probably in general, Magic is an incredibly skill-intensive game. It is not all luck. Stop brushing it off and start looking inward and put in the work. It will pay off.
I agree. I got to talk to Seth and just like, he's like, I'm just a boomer trying to still make it in these streets, right? And it's like, dude, like this year you've won a Pro Tour and top 8'd, and like just showing that, like, after multiple kids and like, I don't know. It's a marriage. Like he just doing it for the dads out there. I just want to give a shout out to Seth really quick.
Yeah. I mean, it's just Magic is so skill intensive and it's so great, and do your best and battle it out there. And I went on a bit of a side tangent there I started thinking about CT and Sanctum in general. So excuse me there earlier about Chicago, but I want to give a shout out to CT as well, which is coming on and dominating with a lot of decks and really innovative decks. And, shout out to you with like the Brain Squall, 4 with the Team Erect deck, very hot. But like, I just think between Sanctum reinventing a lot of ways that players are thinking about things and like these conventional norms and innovating on their own decks that were innovating on their own innovations. So just like in this weird sort of human centipede of decks is crazy. All the while Handshake is showing us at this like same time just how important all these things are, and also like playing stock good decks with like informed decisions and small changes can succeed.
Yeah.
It just shows like how deep Magic is and how much if you put the work in, you can succeed. So, just shout out to both those teams. They all have been absolutely killing it. CFB also did so well. I mean, we're like not even mentioning them, but like, they put multiple players in the top 8. Like you mentioned, Seth top 8'd one and won another Pro Tour. Like, they reinvented with Pioneer with the Vampires deck. So Magic is such a good game.
Yeah, it's at a cool place. If you want to be a part of the show, you can join our Patreon. We have a Discord server, and there's a place to access a document that will give you Patreon question of the week. This week, Nick asks, what platform benefits the podcast to listen on? And that was such an interesting question. Like before the show, I was like, oh, that's interesting. I have not ever thought about this. There is probably an answer, Mason. And I don't know I think that you agree with me that basically if you're going to start the show and complete the show in one sitting, right, then the answer is probably YouTube. What it does for the algorithm there is so powerful to just be started and finished that it's by far the way that you should if you're going to do it that way. If you're not going to do it that way, I don't think it matters. Like Spotify technically tracks plays and listens, meaning like how long they listen, how many times they have to push play to complete it. But it doesn't affect the show getting put anywhere.
Yeah, podcasts are just a task that traditionally people start and stop do things with, but the algorithm doesn't delineate it. It doesn't, at least to our knowledge, doesn't understand the difference. And so when you just watch with full attention, the algorithm's like, oh, you really like this. People who like the things like you like this might want to see this more. So it pushes it to more people. And if a lot of people do that, then that's why I think some episodes just get like so many more views than others because they just like kind of hit the algorithm that way.
So thanks for the great question, Nick. It's something we've never talked about on the show. If you want to join the conversation, the public Discord and the Patreon Discord are great ways to do that. YouTube comments, though, have been popping lately. Really appreciative. Really kind, also. I think it was 2 weeks ago. I don't know if we mentioned last week just how kind the feedback was about the episode, and it's been really cool to see. And then you can also follow the podcast on Twitter at CCMTG. And the best way to support the show: like, subscribe, review. It really does help out. Mason, where can we find you?
On Twitter at Mason E. Clark. Find me at twitch.tv/the Mason Clark. Find me each and every other week on TCG Player, writing about something with Magic. And you can find me for coaching via my Twitter, once again, Mason E. Clark, or reaching out via Gmail, masoneclark@gmail.com. Spencer, what about you?
You can find me at Keys a Game on Twitter. We're taking a little bit of it's kind of hard to schedule stuff for Need to Nerd right now because my co-host was cast as Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and he, that's fast approaching. He's in rehearsal all the time, very busy. So you can check out that podcast on the podcast feeds, and then you can find Abe at More Nothings, as well as reach out for him coaching in his DMs there. Jason, what did you learn on the show this week?
I learned that Spencer is a big fan of the Gruul deck.
What's funny is the prowess, the mutagenic growth in that deck is kind of funny to me. It's like, how often does this work? But I think that I'm a big fan of Scale Up. Like, that card is just cool to me, and I just want to kill somebody with a Scale Up. So I learned that Mason and I agree that they should just cut it off of the head. Just go for it. So thank you, everybody, so much for listening. And we'll see you all next week with another episode of Constructed Criticism.